Hello, everyone. We're going to wait just one moment as participants file in. As I think I note, many of these webinars, I will never understand why Zoom will just not teleport you all into the room at once, but have you file in as if you were filling into a conference room. Funny bit of skeuomorphism. All right, as we cross the threshold, let's begin. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm your host, Greg Lindsay, Director of Strategy for CoMotion, and I'm thrilled to be here today to host today's panel on charging deployment ownership models for city electrification. With EV penetration rates rising and governments of all shapes and sizes looking to mandate emissions reductions goals and phase out the sales of internal combustion engines in the near future, it's more important than ever for us to encourage discourse on the environmental and economic benefits of deploying charging technology in urban centers. So before we begin, I'd like to take this moment at the onset to thank all of our esteemed guests here on the panel for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today, and of course to thank Flow for sponsoring today's session. As a bit of housekeeping, I'd like to remind everyone that today is being recorded for posterity and will be available on YouTube in the coming weeks. Similarly, I'd like to note that all of our attendees are muted today so that our speakers aren't interrupted, but we will definitely be taking audience questions later in the session. So please go down to the bottom there in the Q&A if you can, in the chat if you must, and we'll do our best to pull in your questions at the very end and answer them, should time allow. All right, now before we begin, or I guess as a way to get underway here, we'll start by going around the horn to both introduce ourselves and talk about how each of our guests fits in today into the puzzle pieces that we're trying to assemble. So let's start, as we go around the horn, with Irina Filipova, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Electrada. Irina, can you talk a bit about, obviously, how your charging deployment and ownership model all sorts of fits, and basically sort of give a background on your business and how you sort of see yourself approaching this overall challenge. And we'll have all of our panelists speak about this from their perspective in the opening round. So Irina, please.
Thank you, Greg, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this conversation today. As Greg has said, my name is Irina Filipova. I am the Chief Operating Officer of Electrada. I've been with Electrada since its inception. We're a young company. We started operations in the midst of the pandemic in April 2020. So just over a year and a half old in operations. And our goal at Electrada is to bring reliable, ubiquitous electric vehicle charging to cities, residential communities, workplaces, and fleets. The genesis behind Electrada was really to create EV charging that was reliable, first and foremost, and present for those use cases that were emerging as EV adoption was gathering speed. We're based in Cincinnati, Ohio, and as some of our viewers and listeners would know, sometimes the Midwest region is overlooked in terms of both EV adoption and deployment of EV charging infrastructure. We also were created to really offer the market the opportunity for a turnkey solution that Electrada provides as the investor in the infrastructure and a company that brings a totality of the deployment to our site host partners, including cities, municipalities, and other public entities. So we have seen the sometimes unintended consequences of some of those early EV infrastructure deployments, whereby a grant or an incentive would help capitalize the actual equipment, but there was very little by way of maintenance and operation of that equipment going forward. Lo and behold, a couple of years down the road, that equipment was what we call dead-headed or dead on arrival. Very frustrating for EV drivers, very frustrating for city administrators and urban planners and everyone who would need to use it. So we came into being as the entity that would take on the provision of that reliability and back the performance of the equipment that we were deploying.
Wonderful. Yes, everyone wants to supply with new equipment. No one ever wants to maintain it. Always the bane of all urban infrastructure, even when it's brand new. So it's glad to know someone is on the case there. Going around the horn, let's go to Shawn Yavari, who's a senior specialist in the electric vehicle demonstration projects arm of Edison. So a utility viewpoint. Shawn, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shawn. As Greg mentioned, I'm at Con Edison, the utility company for New York City and Westchester County. As part of the demonstration projects team, I'm working on two major projects. So the first and the main one I'll talk about today is a collaboration with New York City Department of Transportation and at Energy Flow to deploy public curbside chargers in all 5 boroughs of New York City. And it will be a 3 to 4 year demonstration. And we're really excited to gather data, gain understanding on the business model, and figure out how to reach the lofty DOT goals of 1,000 plugs by 2025 and 10,000 by 2030. And then the other demonstration project is a V2G demonstration up in White Plains in Westchester County involving 5 electric school buses.
Excellent, thanks. All right, we'll get back into some more of that in a bit too, and some of the specifics, but I want to keep going around this time to Steve Young, who's joining us from the west coast of Canada. He is the Climate and Environmental Sustainability Specialist at the City of Victoria on Vancouver Island. Welcome, Steve.
Hey, Greg. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Looking forward to our discussion. City of Victoria, for those that don't know it, has a population of about 90,000. So it's a relatively small municipality, but it's a very urban municipality with approximately 80% of our residents in multi-unit buildings. So despite that, Victoria and its environs has one of the highest adoption of EVs in Canada. And we are very ambitious on our climate front. So we are seeking to see over 30% of vehicles on our roads renewably powered by 2030. So while we have a relatively small deployment of level 2 chargers at the moment, we have 19 public level 2 chargers that are owned and operated and maintained by the city. We are ambitious to do a lot more. So we expect to have over 50 level 2 chargers installed over the next few months. We'll be installing our first DC fast charger early next year. And then through 2022 to 2026, we'll expect to deploy about 100 level 2 public chargers and about half a dozen DC fast chargers each year. So we have a network of about 650 level 2s and 35 public DC fast chargers by the end of 2026. So those numbers can represent our ambition to meet our climate action goals and to do so in a way that sort of supports the needs of the community, recognizing that with most people in our urban neighborhoods living in apartment buildings, they don't and they won't have access to at-home charging for at least for the next 5 years or so.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I would encourage all of our viewers to definitely go check out the City of Victoria. Big friends and fans. We're fans of Mayor Lisa Helps and all the great work the city's doing there. And then finally coming around to our round the horn here to Francis Baillargeon to talk a bit about, I guess, from the supplier perspective there. So obviously we've got a couple different approaches here, different perspectives. Francis, I'm curious your thoughts on sort of deployment ownership models as well.
Thanks, Greg, and great to be here and great to see so many familiar faces on the panel and companies we've partnered with in the past. So my name is Francis Baillargeon. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Flow Ad Energy. We are, Greg mentioned we're a supplier, but we're more than that. We are a network operator. We're vertically integrated. We're one of the, if you look at all of the chargers that we've deployed to date, they add up to the third biggest connected network in North America. We are based in Quebec City. I'm talking to you today from Montreal, but I actually live in Toronto, and we are now up to, we just passed the cap of 50,000 chargers deployed in the history of the company, including over 1,000 DC fast chargers, and that's across about 20 territories in both Canada and in the US, and we're vertically integrated. And so I'll actually correct Greg a bit. We actually do like to do the maintenance of our chargers. We actually think that if we do it, and if you have someone who has a vested interest in doing so, then we will increase the reliability of EV charging broadly. And our ethos, our mission is to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles to help in the fight against climate change, by offering the best charging experience to our site hosts and to EV drivers broadly. And so we take that very seriously. That's why we develop all of our own hardware, software in-house, and why we do for a lot of our customers, some of whom are on the panel today, we do the maintenance as well of our network, which allows us to provide superior uptime to our customers. We broadly feel that what is good for our company is good for EV charging broadly, and vice versa. And so reliability has been historically an issue for EV charging broadly, and that's something that we work very hard on, both inside our company and working with some of our what might be viewed as our competitors to improve that overall for the industry. Because we think that's going to be a key development that will allow electric vehicle adoption over time. So pleased to be here.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, Francis. Yes, as a Montreal resident here, I noticed all the great chargers in great condition. Let's delve a little bit deeper into this, because Steve alluded to this in your discussion there about some of the obviously the various goals of the city, and I want to get into this notion of sort of like what are the strategic decisions that go into the deployment of this in a city or utility scale. So, Rena, if you could go first on this. I mentioned at the outset there's both obviously environmental and economic objectives that coincide or alternately at play, and I guess I'm sort of curious. What are sort of like what is the strategy driving your own deployments there, and how do you sort of make the case?
Well, this is a great question, Greg, and I also think a great challenge for cities today, because a lot of what we are seeing in terms of city administrations is waiting for that federal infrastructure bill that's going to come through, waiting for that next grant program or an incentive or a make-ready incentive from a utility before doing anything about creating EV charging infrastructure for the citizens and the community. Which is why, in our opinion, partnering with third-party providers who take, like us, capital risk and all the operational risk associated with deploying the infrastructure is a key component to actually providing infrastructure when it's needed, where it's needed, based on the specifics of each site where we deploy, based on the use case, based on the demand, instead of simply being passive and being the recipient of whatever happens at the policy level. Every city, I think, is now beginning to think very, very hard about meeting their environmental and sustainability goals. Obviously, transportation is a huge element to meeting those goals. And another component to this is obviously energy. So both in the transportation sector and in the energy sector, and the two of them are actually colliding when it comes to electric vehicle charging, those goals are quite ambitious. So the time is upon us as those new EV models are rolling off the conveyor belts from both newcomers to the market and the established OEMs to meet that need of those drivers living in the multi-unit residential complexes, not having access to EV charging otherwise, or just simply easing their day and enabling them to top off at a public location. I think the time is now for the urban developers, for city administrators to start taking those steps that are very concrete in terms of how to meet their environmental goals and how to actually meet their city budgets requirements. So when we come in, when Electrada comes in, we take on all the capital costs associated with the deployment, and we SLA, service level agreement, back the performance of those chargers that we install. So effectively, there's no risk and there is no burden, if you will, on the city staff, on the facilities team, on the transportation team, on the fleet team to actually maintain the equipment over its lifetime. Out of the gate, we've actually partnered with Fluid Energy, primarily because we have found that working with them has been really easy. We got to learn a lot about EV charging deployment, especially in the city environment. We also got to really reap the benefits of partnering with an integrated service provider, not just the hardware provider or the network provider, but someone who had both being offered under the same umbrella. And we would certainly recommend to those cities that are currently looking at solutions to really take that under consideration, because integrating hardware and software in this new industry is still very wrought with risks and challenges.
Thank you, Irina. I want to go to Steve next on this. And from the city standpoint, I was just reminded, Steve, that CoMotion's sister org, New Cities, hosted its final pre-pandemic event in Victoria, and it was called Leading by Example, How Canadian Cities Are Leading on the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm assuming environmental considerations play a big part in this. How is Victoria leading by example on the front of electrification and charging?
Yeah, so I think just to riff off Irina's point a little bit, I would like to talk about our adopted draft EV strategy. So it's just about to be finalised, and I think it's important to understand the scale. So our climate leadership plan was developed to align with the Paris Agreement. So we asked ourselves, what do we need to do as a city to meet our share of the obligations to manage climate change? And transportation obviously was a huge part of that, because transportation is a huge part of our GHG emissions. So then you kind of narrowed the scale down a little bit further and said, okay, so what exactly do we need to do in the community for passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles for their share of that slice of the target? And then our draft EV strategy puts a price on that. It says, how much is it going to cost and where do we need to invest? And the answer was, we need to invest in private infrastructure and we need to invest in public infrastructure. And we came up, the price tag is $60 million. So bear in mind, this is a relatively small city, so it's not an insubstantial amount of money. And then the question that came up after that is, okay, who pays for it? Which I think speaks to Irina's point. We can't wait for the capital to be there, because certainly municipalities, there's always demands for capital. The public's tax dollars pulled in many different directions, and so if you're going to enter that arena, then waiting for the money to be available, and there is a lot of money available. Don't get me wrong. In Canada, the federal and provincial government are definitely stepping up and providing resources. But we also have to kind of hold people's feet to the fire as well, and saying this is a support your city needs or Victoria needs to meet the target. So we think we can invest about $15 million over the next 5 years building private, supporting private investment in EV charging, and obviously investing in public charging. So that's kind of where things are at for us. We built a plan, and we now know what we want to do and when we want to do it, and we are telling others about it now. So this obviously is part of that opportunity. I would certainly encourage other cities that are listening in to think about what they need in terms of an EV strategy and a plan going forward, because with that plan in hand, we can go knocking on the doors of others to support our capital investments.
Great, thanks. Shawn, certainly don't want to leave you out. I mean, obviously you're working with, as you mentioned, multiple locations. So I'm curious if there's a mix of different logics there. What's sort of driving their strategic decisions of your city partners there?
Yeah, I on our end, our partners are considering things like equity, which neighborhoods have a lot of EVs, where there's political support and community member support for charging infrastructure, and in terms of this pilot, we set out to build out 100 curbside chargers. It's kind of a round number. I don't think I can get too specific about it, because they chose 1,000, another round number for 2025, 10,000 for 2030. But just setting goals in terms of growth and trying to keep up with the number of EVs that are being bought in this throughout the 5 boroughs.
Well, this is set up for you as a follow-up to that then, Shawn. My next question for you is going to be on sort of like, data collection and metrics and measurements. So it's interesting that they're basically choosing round numbers. That would suggest that perhaps it's not a really granular, but I am curious, once they're deploying that, if equity is a goal for them, how are they measuring whether those, that pilot is equitable, and how are they going to sort of choose future deployments? I'm sort of curious what you're using for data collection there to understand what makes a deployment successful or a particular location successful, or and then figuring out what the deployment pattern should be going forward. Obviously, this is a big question looming over all the pilots that are happening across America and beyond right now.
Yeah, I guess so. We could probably think about this pilot and the data we're measuring in 3 buckets. So The first, we think of, okay, how are our community stakeholders accepting the curbside EV charging stations? And so for that, we're measuring, we're using surveys to measure community satisfaction scores. And then this and some other data, but on the second bucket, we can think, okay, are the curbside charging stations having a significant role in the charging ecosystem? And so for that, we measure data like median utilization. We'll use Flow's customer satisfaction score on that one. And then the third bucket is curbside charging financially viable and scalable? And for that, we're measuring things like sales revenue for the, for all of the stations, but also looking at which ones are the most successful or and where are those. And then also looking at operating hours and uptime, which Flow has phenomenal uptime statistics.
Great. Steve, I'd love your thoughts as well. I mean, since you mentioned, obviously, you have to be frugal as a small city. I'm curious how you are collecting that data and measuring performance as well and what those metrics are.
Yeah, for us, equity is going to be a big part in the future. All our public chargers are smart chargers at the moment, so we get all the data that that Flow is able. We use Flow for our network, so we get all the data that Flow is able to pull from the chargers, so we know when people are charging, we know how long they're charging for, and certainly we can use that information to guide our deployment rates. So for us, we're not really trying to hit that sweet spot where we're maximizing the income from our chargers, but we are trying to make sure the chargers are always available. So when we see availability start to suffer, that's a signal to us that either we need to look at pricing changes or we need to look at building out our infrastructure. And of course, we're looking mostly at building out our infrastructure at the moment. In future, I think there's some fundamental questions around equity and whether the network that we're building is doing the job it's supposed to do. So we want to see GHG emission reductions directly on the dashboard, so we know exactly what each charging station is delivering in terms of helping us meet our target. But we need information as well that we just won't get from the chargers and people using the chargers. We need to know how many people in the neighborhood we deployed a charger feel comfortable now to go out and buy an EV that wouldn't have done so otherwise. How are the people that are using the charger the people we expected to use the charger? Is the price a barrier? Are people not using it because it's too expensive? What do we need to do to our rates there? So I think that answer is probably quite different from what you'd hear for our private charging networks. And I think it's very evolving as well. And certainly I'm excited to hear that Shawn is doing work in this area. And it's certainly an area that I've been discussing with some of the local universities for us as we deploy our particular DC fast charger networks. We want to really understand the users, and we'll obviously tune our deployment in future to see if it's been used the way we anticipate it to be used.
Thank you, Steve. Irina has her hand up, so I was going to call on you next, but definitely with that. Yeah, I'm curious how you see this, and then I want to hear Francis's thoughts as well in terms of what data really is the sort of the telltale data or the most important stuff you're pulling off of it. But Irina, go first.
Thank you. Both Steve and Shawn made excellent points about the importance of the chargers being smart, meaning networked, collecting the data, reviewing it, monitoring it, responding to the data. But I just wanted to take a quick step back and say that in addition to that, all data is obviously relative. So we need to be very realistic in terms of which market we're deploying this EV charging infrastructure in. What are the EV adoption rates in that market? How do our assumptions and anticipated growth match that steep EV adoption growth curve that everyone sees on all the reports? So that's important just to set this into context. There's been numerous studies that have highlighted the fact that the charging infrastructure needs to be in place before the actual adoption takes place. In some cases, it's 2 years before. In some cases, in the case of public infrastructure, as many as 5 years. 5 years ahead of that hockey stick curve going up. which means that it takes a while for folks to really get comfortable with the fact that the infrastructure is there, that it's reliable, that it's ubiquitous, and that feeds also into the equity point. How many EV models are widely affordable right now that are available in the market? When do we anticipate that market peak in terms of EV sales to actually happen? So all of these factors actually play a role. And my message is simply, it's not too soon to deploy EV charging infrastructure, even though you're not seeing half of the vehicles on the road being EVs yet, but you need that infrastructure in place first before that conversion actually can take place.
Thank you, Irina. And then Francis, obviously, I would love your take on this as well, and Flo's take on this.
Yeah, look, I think, you know, and I'm glad that we have the composition of panelists that we do have here today. I think maybe except at a personal level, the one entity or key constituency that's missing is the EV driver themselves, but we really view the data as being something that can really benefit the ecosystem. We haven't spoken much about it. I'm certainly no expert, but grid capacity is obviously going to be something that many utilities are going to have to wrestle with, and I'm sure Shawn has some views on that. And you know, it's easy also to speak of grid capacity, you know, in the absolute, but as we look at it at the deployment level, you know, as certain segments, particularly fleets, or particularly with, you know, other than Tesla, I think most EV charging networks tend to have a smaller number of chargers per site at first, but that will change over time, particularly as some fleet applications develop. And so really being able to bring power at the site and figure out how much that is going to be extremely important, because the reality is today we are building the infrastructure and hoping they will come, and we know they will come, but how much to build and when is going to be, in my view, a key determinant of how quickly adoption does occur, because charging is, and you know, we can say what we want about EV availability and supply chain issues and so on, but certainly charging availability is one of the key factors that can drive EV adoption, or frankly, unfortunately, slow it down. And so I think that's something that's very important. And so that means that we need to have, and I think that, you know, if you look at how you know, gasoline is distributed today, things like usage, things like density, and so on and so forth have very little impact on, you know, when people fill up their gasoline powered car, what time of day. And so I think we have a great opportunity here to start with really a blank page in terms of looking at things like pricing and incentives and where we deploy chargers. And so we view that data as being extremely valuable and being really quite a key component to deploying infrastructure. We're not only a network operator, and we do sell stations and software. We actually own and operate our own stations ourselves. We have about 500 of those, and you know, we look at those statistics for our own network as well, and they're supremely important. Everyone here knows that, you know, in addition to the hardware costs that are and software costs that are frankly somewhat predictable in any deployment, the big question mark is how much it'll take you to bring electricity to site. And it can sometimes be multiples in certain circumstances of what the actual cost of the infrastructure itself. And so really understanding what usage is going to be, both in terms of patterns, in terms of intensity, and so on, is going to be really important. That's why we're really pleased to be able to partner with some of the folks on this panel in order to help everyone think through those frankly somewhat complicated equations.
Thank you. Well, there's a lot of great questions coming in now. This is like one of the most involved audiences I've ever seen on here. So thank you, everyone who's leaving extremely detailed, great questions here. But before I start throwing to them, because we're about halfway through and we'll be here for hours if I try to answer everything, I want to go to Shawn quickly on this and the grid issues there, and your thoughts on this, because I've seen, you know, eye-watering statistics that require massive expansions of the grid to bring this future about, with percentages as high as 1,000% in some places. But I am sort of curious how you sort of see the grid capacity issues tying into this, and, you know, how quickly and how they'll be resolved.
Yeah, so on the demonstration project side, we don't work too much with that, but my colleagues on the Power Ready team work closely with developers to incentivize or cover almost all, if not all, of the make ready or utility side investments, so transformers, trenching, site preparation, and all of that, to prepare for this infrastructure to be built out. And so we have a budget set out by the Public Services Commission, and work with developers to take in applications and get those projects going.
Great. All right, let's get into the audience Q&A here, because some good ones. I'll package a couple together here, because there's a couple of questions about sort of the framing of this. So Josh Ward has in the Q&A, why does Flo and others believe that cities' role are to implement infrastructure for public charging? Someone else, Jeff Quint, asked, won't most EV drivers charge at home? Is there really a need for this vast public infrastructure? And then I think John Payne gets to the crux of it in chat, the compelling argument to elected public officials to spend tax dollars 2 to 5 years before they're needed. How do you sell that up the chain? So I don't know, Steve, if you're the place to start on this, but yeah, some really interesting questions here about the role of cities. I imagine equity has something to do with it, and this is why public goods exist. But yeah, why should cities be taking the lead in implementing this versus private homeowners, private sector, et cetera?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think the answer is the cities aren't necessarily the right place across the whole network to take the lead. And certainly Victoria isn't aiming to take a lead in certain areas. Some areas it just makes sense for the private sector to take the lead, where there's high demand and there's no equity issues, then why wouldn't a utility or the private sector deliver the charging network? And if everyone's happy, that's great. There's no need for tax dollars to be invested. And certainly in British Columbia and to a certain extent across Canada, we've seen that model being deployed for inter-urban transportation. So we've got an established Trans-Canada network now that's growing, and that's largely been done without support from local governments. It's been built by the federal government using federal government money, and the private sector's also stepped in to build their own cross-country networks as well. And I don't see much of a role for cities there, apart from potentially providing sites on public land, which is something the city did for fast charger downtown. For us, where our real interest is in, one, meeting our community greenhouse gas targets. So that's about our residents and our businesses. What do they need to meet their targets? And then there's the equity issue as well. As I mentioned earlier, 80% of our residents live in multi-unit buildings. We're already seeing the impacts of that in who's buying EVs in the city. We've done the studies, and the vast majority of people that are buying EVs are the 20% that are in single family homes or in ground oriented dwellings. So that means already there's a certain inequity being created just by that land use types. So we don't want to see equity exacerbated, obviously, inequity exacerbated. So that's one compelling reason why you might want to think about a public charging network. And then for us, our focus really is on our neighborhoods. And so how do we support fast charging in our neighborhoods, or just charging in our neighborhoods? So that's where we're focusing our attention, both how do we support getting more charging infrastructure, and that's actually the bulk of the cost of our plan is retrofitting existing buildings. The public piece is a smaller part, but it's a more immediate part because we recognise that there's such significant barriers to retrofitting existing apartment buildings that it just won't be achieved in time to meet the goals that we need to reach by 2030. So that's the role that I see for public charging, at least in Victoria. It's fairly narrow. It'll be certainly the lifetime of the first generation of infrastructure, but once those DC fast chargers and level 2 chargers reach the end of their life, it would certainly be a question of whether we still need them or not. But for the next 10 years, I think public charging is absolutely essential to get this level of adoption we need, certainly from a climate point of view.
All right, so not even 2 to 5 years, 10 years out in that case. Irina, you have your hand up.
Thank you very much, Greg. I'll lower my hand. So one other thought to add to what Steve has just said. Yes, we will obviously rely on residential and workplace charging for any protracted amount of time charging up one's vehicle. That is true. What we also need to keep in mind, though, is that driving an EV is not like driving a conventional vehicle. Your behaviors as a driver change. In other words, you relate to your EV more like you relate to your portable device in terms of thinking of charging it up and topping off during the day. You're out on your errands, you're out for a concert, or you go into a restaurant, or you're parking again at your workplace location. You are charging up as you go. And that is the pattern in which EV drivers relate to charging. It's no longer going out of your way to a destination like a gas station to fuel up, which is why the model of only DC fast charging matches the current fueling model, why it's flawed, because our behaviors change. Cars eventually would be charged wherever they're parked. And obviously it's incumbent upon our utilities, incumbent upon developers like Electrada to make that available to EV drivers in various use cases. But eventually we will be used to the fact that the car, wherever it's parked, it can be charged, so it can be on our way, whether we charge it for half an hour, 15 minutes, or 4 to 5 hours during the day.
Thank you, Irina. Francis, quickly.
Yeah, I've probably been spending a bit too much time with Irina in the past because she's summarized most of what I was going to say, but so I'll emphatically agree with what she did mention. But we do view, 2 points. I think charging at home again means different things to different people, and is for example Con Edison's deployment of curbside charging residential charging, or is it public charging? It's actually both. Anyone can show up, and obviously not every charger today is going to be perfectly, or there's not going to be a charger in front of every, for example, row house or townhouse or low-rise multi-unit residential building where there's not perhaps integrated parking. But as cities, as utilities, as promoters of the ecosystem, we have to absolutely, I think, create incentives for everyone to adopt electric vehicles. And frankly, the traditional mantra of someone installing a lower priced, easier to install residential charger, and we do offer them as well. It's about a third of our revenue, but is probably the easiest issue to solve, and the one that needs the fewest incentives from certainly the municipality side. I think once you go to the utility side, that's where having connected charging and the ability to influence demand or timing of demand or intensity of demand becomes supremely important. And when you add up all of the demand from just purely traditional single family home residential charging, we see in some perhaps wealthier areas where you've got Teslas and other high-end brands of electric vehicles that start to become critical mass, that you do start to see a strain on perhaps some older or less developed grids. And so these are challenges that we collectively are going to have to all grapple with. And so that's why we view EV charging as being both a private and a public access question that we need to answer.
Thank you, Francis. And Shawn, finish us off on this question.
Hi, yes. Firstly, just wanted to kind of echo what others have said, and especially in a city like New York City with a lot of multifamily folks who live in multifamily dwellings. The last thing we want to see is have a bunch of customers letting down extension cords from their third-story walk-ups to have to charge. So that's why this public infrastructure is really important. And then I saw a question about enforcement that's been really top of mind. So I was going to go ahead and answer that if that's okay.
Please, that was going to be my next question. So I'll expand upon that in a moment, but take that first, Shawn.
Yeah, it's been a real challenge, especially when we're at this phase where we have 32 plugs out of the 100 in the program that will be online by hopefully by the end of October. And at this point, we really are relying on the city to take care of enforcement. And so they've been supplying the list of active sites to NYPD and working to make sure that those sites aren't iced, or that they don't have a internal combustion engine vehicle parked there blocking an electric vehicle. And from there, we'll see how that works and continue the conversation and working with the city and DOT specifically.
Thank you, Shawn. Rena, you read my mind because yes, in the chat, I see your conversation with David Dunham about squatting and about these issues. And there was a question in Q&A also about sort of vandalism. I mean, yeah, failing maintenance is one thing, deliberate destruction of property is another. As norms change by drivers, how do we enforce, basically positive norms in terms of how this infrastructure is used fairly?
Great segue, Greg. Thank you. And Shawn, bravo for getting NYPD on the case of policing EV parking spots. I can't imagine what it took to get there. But effectively, for example, when Electrada partners with site hosts, including municipalities and cities, we actually have a net revenue share agreement in place with our site hosts. Why? Because we'd like them to feel incentivized in making sure that those spots indeed are reserved for EVs, that they actively monitor, that they visit when they notice that there is potentially an ICE vehicle sitting in that spot, that they proactively do something about it. They're there at the site. We cannot be everywhere. We're not eyes and ears at every site when we're deployed. So having that agreement with a site host is very important. As to the issue of vandalism, obviously extremely important on busy city streets. Unfortunately, there's little we can do about folks who want to do it. That said, I will say that from our experience, certainly using Flows equipment, it is built to last. It's very durable. It's ruggedized for every type of weather, for every type of use case and deployment. The cables are now stamped to where the copper from them cannot be resold to dealers. So there are ways in which, again, this can be tracked and monitored, but this is where, again, partnership with the city as a whole, and in the case of New York with NYPD, is so crucial, so that it becomes a community asset that a community is watching over. It's not just kind of one installed kind of and gone type of arrangement. Everyone should be intricately involved in making sure that this asset continues to perform. I'm sure Francis has some comments on this as well.
I was just about to say, I imagine our Canadian participants here have less to offer in the vandalism question if all cliches are true. But yeah, Francis or Steve, thoughts on this sort of like regulating norms around this? If this is going to be in the public realm, how do we regulate the norms around how this infrastructure is used?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think as it pertains to vandalism, I think there's no magic solution. But I'm a strong believer personally in incentives, and so I think that's why. Frankly, the partnerships and to everyone who's a decision maker there, decision maker on the line today, whether it's with Flow or anyone else, I would just encourage you to work with different partners that do have that mentality, because I think that's a really key to success for deployments. And look, again, this is not obviously EVs are replacing gasoline cars, but to reiterate the earlier point, usage patterns are different, and so people will have to adjust to the fact that we will have to find ways to regulate how parking stalls that have EV charging capabilities are used. Again, I think we have a great privilege of not being saddled by 100 or 125 years of frankly unconnected parking space management, because parking tickets I'm sure existed 100 years ago, and people still complain about them today, but the reality is it's something that we've all had to live with. However, I think that being able, and this is one of the nice benefits of IoT or connected devices broadly, and it really applies to EV charging, it actually becomes fairly easy to address some of those issues around parking. We'd love to, we're doing some pilots with some smart city people that are doing some really interesting things around, I would say street and parking usage patterns broadly, and I think that's a great opportunity again to make more efficient just basically the use of public parking spaces.
Thank you, Steve. Any thoughts to add on this before we move on to the next question? Obviously, you're the city participant here.
On the vandalism question, it's not something that we've encountered thus far, but we're certainly aware of it. In terms of how we manage it, we've been looking very closely at the warranties as well as the equipment. So certainly robust equipment is something that you want to consider there. Availability of parts, so you can get the opportunity, so you can keep your system operating. So that's definitely been a consideration for us as well. So that kind of speaks to the point of flows that Francis was making earlier on around maintenance and operation. It's as a city, we're looking for a package that sees our network operating. We're not just looking at hardware, despite the fact we have a team in-house that can do the installations, but we want to make sure it stays operating. And the other piece I would throw out there, not so much as just an observation, I think, is that some of the sites that we've seen, certainly on the corridor charging, are maybe not are maybe not balancing out safety as well as they could if you're at the back of a parking lot, a vast parking lot of a large superstore or something like that. That may not be the place that you really want to be driving customers to. And it may also be more vulnerable to vandalism than a site that's in a dense urban area where there's people around all the time, sort of thing. So I'd say site selection is maybe something that you can also use to control vandalism. But that said, I'm not coming from a great base of experience there. We'll be learning that one along with everyone else, I think.
Thank you, Steve. Quick question for Francis. The Flow competition set of questions here. Our first question was, I know this is sponsored by Flow, and kudos to the anonymous asker, but I'm curious, who are the big players in the EV charger space in North America? Are we seeing more mature European ones come in? How do you expect the landscape to change? And there was another question, which Irina, doing double duty in Q&A, already started to answer questions about sort of roaming and whether we can start to see that become a possibility as well. And so, yeah, so I'm curious, what's the Flow perspective on sort of these issues? And I think there's a couple other aspects about what incentives are cities able to offer that you would be interested in. So if you could address a few of those questions floating around.
Sure. So look, I think in terms of competition, the participant rightly pointed out that I think Europe is more advanced than North America broadly in terms of electrification. I think the landscape in Europe is quite fragmented, but there in terms of the number of network operators, and there are a number of this is necessarily a panel around business models for EV charge or EV network operators, but some people are not vertically integrated like we are and focus either on the hardware or the software or the servicing side, or only a few of those components. And so there are some bigger players in Europe. A few of them have mentioned ambitions to come into North America. There's certainly on the hardware side some of the bigger and frankly more established companies that are also important providers. I would say that our competition comes broadly from people that have similar business models and similar operating histories as we've been in business for over 12 years now, which makes us a dinosaur in the EV charging industry and is great. And there's also, I would say, some more local incumbents that can simply raise some money and then piece together hardware and software in a somewhat disparate way, and then that's where I think, frankly, a lot of the EV charging as an activity has gotten sometimes a unfortunately deserved reputation for not being particularly reliable. And so, without naming any of our competitors, again, we encourage site hosts to do their homework around what kind of solution they're getting, and is it in line with their goals, not just to check the box on perhaps a number of charging ports that you want to deploy, but really to create a sustainable infrastructure to drive environmental sustainability. In terms of interoperability or roaming, That's something that has been a key feature of our industry for a number of years now. Flow Ad Energy actually did the industry's first roaming agreement between two networks in 2018. Our network today gives access to about 55,000 charging ports through some of our competitors, or you'd say co-competitors, are people that both compete and cooperate with us, because we do believe that open standards are something that's here to stay. There's obviously still a fragmented space in Canada, and if you are in North America, sorry, and if you believe at all that Europe is a precursor to what will happen in North America, the European marketplace is very, very fragmented, at least at the moment. There may be some consolidation, but so providing the best experience for our EV drivers, which means providing interoperability, is quite important. And people often, I would say a lot of whether it's ourselves or others, like I don't think there's anyone that's particularly evenly distributed in terms of their network presence. And the reality is, if you look at one of the key obstacles to EV adoption today, people love EVs for their day-to-day life and even for their commute. And you hear a lot, and I'm sure this is very familiar to anyone here. Someone will say, but there's these 1 or 2 times a year where I have to drive 1,000 kilometers to go visit a relative or something like that, and I don't think an EV can take me there. And I've heard that infrastructure is unreliable. And so that goes well beyond, frankly, some of the regional concentration that you see in across most networks. And so for us, it became apparent very, very early in our history that we needed to facilitate charging via other networks to the EV drivers that are members of our network.
Thank you, Francis. We're running out of time. We got 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna see what I can do. Irina, here's a specific question for you. There's a number of questions out there, and I think you started to answer one about some of the residential questions. I know there's one questioner asked about, how do we serve high rises in Global South, Mexico City, Sao Paulo. Russ Mitchell, hi Russ, has a question about apartment building owners charging high prices, basically gouging people for dealing with this. And then there was one I think you answered. So if you could expand upon some of your points there about how the residential piece works of this.
Sure, very happy to. And again, residential is extremely important. About 40% of urban area residents do live in multi-unit residential communities. So that is the population that you want to address as a developer, as the owner of electric vehicle infrastructure, as we are. So the first thing that I will say is that because of those early incentive and grant-driven deployments, there has been a perception in the market that perhaps the EV charging should be free of charge or cost exactly what it costs to plug in any electrical appliance at home. That is false, because again, to bring in and capitalize reliable, durable equipment at a location is a very, very capital intensive project. So it cannot be absolutely free. It's also a major risk on the part of the developer, again, like ourselves, to put in that capital today, expecting the EV adoption to really take off in 5 to 10 year period of time, which is why when we go in and we partner with developers and residential building owners, we actually strike a long-term site host agreement with them to where we expect that adoption to happen slowly. The market price, the market clearing price that's generally gets set, we certainly prefer to charge per kilowatt hour, which is a much fairer basis for charging versus temporal charging, because that really depends on the type of vehicle that you're driving. So if you're charging, or your fees that you pay for charging are on the per kilowatt hour basis, you're actually paying for the energy that you're extracting to charge your vehicle. So that is to address kind of the pricing and the gouging, and you can very easily on PlugShare see how much is being charged in a particular market and compare if your residential building is gouging you on prices or not. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is that within the LEED standards, and I know that Steve has mentioned retrofitting some of the existing buildings, but certainly for a lot of the new structures, those that are kind of going for LEED Silver, Gold, or Platinum, there are 2 points on the LEED qualification that require or that speak to EV charging being deployed. Certain number of parking spaces being equipped with EV charging, and that kind of raises the ranking for the building. We're seeing a lot of the residential communities becoming very, very competitive because a lot of the residents actually don't want to sign a lease or certainly purchase a condo if there isn't a possibility to charge their potentially future EV. But again, that future is right around the corner. So again, as folks are thinking about kind of how real estate is impacted, be thinking about what trends exist in the market and what your residents are likely to want, and kind of tap into those trends.
All right, thank you. We're at 6 minutes left here, so we're going to do a quick lightning round here. John Payne has been kind enough to just throw down the gauntlet. Have pencil in hand, waiting for that compelling argument from the panel that wins over my elected officials to build 2 to 5 years ahead. Calls out Irina, but you just went. I want to hear from Steve, then Shawn, then Francis, then back to Irina to see if you can close. What is your pitch to that elected official that's going to basically compel them to write the check for that? Steve, how did you make the argument, or how would you make it again?
I think I've covered some of that ground already. I think for us, we have a climate leadership plan. Council's committed to it. They've adopted it. We know we can't meet our targets without the substantial investment in EV charging infrastructure, both in the private and public sector. So that was a fairly straight path. You've adopted this plan. If you wanted to succeed, it needs investment. And certainly for our council, we had no difficulty rationalising that argument and for them to understand why. The other piece was I touched on was the equity piece. If we want to see EVs bring huge benefits to a community in terms of both the sort of affordability, so if we can build so people can travel across the community more with less maintenance costs, less fuel costs, and obviously air quality improvements as well, and none of those are to be ignored. I think by politicians. I think that we've seen a lot of the push for EVs has been around things as simple as air quality. So I think those are all very compelling arguments when you put those together. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Steve. Shawn, Francis, Rita, any other arguments? What's your elevator pitch for this? Shawn, please.
Yeah, I guess my elevator pitch would be, every city is different, and just looking at how this pilot has gone so far, it takes a lot of time and effort to figure out, okay, how are we going to design this, these chargers to adapt it to? There had to be a whole new design to adapt the charger to NYC. How are we going to select the sites, verify the viability of those sites, do the engineering design, do the construction and installation, involving trenching and crane operations and cost of business in whatever city you're in. How are we going to do the marketing? How is that going to be adapted to our city? How are we going to do the maintenance, and who's going to do the 24/7 monitoring of these stations? And that can all be very expensive the first time you do it. And it's going to take a lot of time, and you can't do it all in 1 year. It took a lot of time to get to this point, and you don't want to get caught surprised when it's time to really have all these chargers deployed. You can't just take the mold that some other city has done already. You have to come up with a solution that works for your city and your constituents, and that takes a significant amount of time and effort.
Thank you, Francis.
I mean, I think at a higher level, a couple of arguments to convince elected officials to do that. I mean, they are elected officials. I think that people are, and I know there's a mix of Canadian and US listeners on there, participants on the line. We just had a federal election in Canada, and environment's at the forefront. And this is one of the main things that particularly municipalities can do that contributes to their emissions reduction goals in a way that is very meaningful. And this is coming. It's undeniable. If you look at what OEMs are doing, if you look at what things are being done at the state and federal level, it's pretty commonly accepted that the two main things that people can we can do broadly to reduce emissions, and I'll admit it's in that order, are to retrofit buildings for energy purposes and to promote the electrification of transportation. And at the municipal level, as opposed to the federal or state or provincial level, it's much harder to create the types of incentives for building retrofits. So this is possibly, I would argue, the lowest hanging fruit. And the reality is, for municipalities, particularly in perhaps more urban areas where it's easier to make cases for installing chargers, that's how people are going to be driving. And those are the people that you want on your cityscapes and going to your local shops and so on. And so people are expecting that, as we said, as a complement to home charging, but to really incentivize people. And frankly, at some point there's going to be a delineation, I would anticipate, between municipalities that have embraced electrification and those that haven't. And the same way that someone might look at proximity to good schools when picking a neighborhood, I think they'll want to have a city that reflects their beliefs around climate change, but also that allows them to carry on about their activities in a way that's convenient for them, and that will very quickly become EV charging, in my view.
Everything is economic development and talent attraction in the end. Irina, can you do this as a tagline? We're almost out of time here. What is your elevator pitch?
Happy to do it. John Payne, happy to talk to your elected official. We offer no capital, no risk, no operating cost, high reliability, performance-backed contract, and a share of net revenues back to you.
Thank you. And if we do this as a replay, we should have big graphics behind you as you tick those off. We're at the top of the hour. I know folks are going to have to jump here as they move on to Zoom World, but I want to go one more time around the horn quickly for posterity and the replays here to ask our panelists. Obviously we've got deployments in Victoria and there's pilots there in New York. Quickly, what have you learned? What are your next steps? How do you imagine the evolution of this, and sort of what's the near future for each of you? So, Steve, we could start with you. Obviously, it sounds like you have a 10-year plan, but what are the immediate next steps, and what are you looking at?
We'll have our first owned, operated, and managed DC fast charger installed in a neighbourhood early next year. We were looking to learn a whole bunch of lessons on that. So we chatted about data earlier on. So I'm hoping to work with a local academic institution to really understand how that site's being used and take our lessons learned there. So really kind of delving deep into neighbourhood charging and how it works, and does it work the way we hope it works. And then we also need to do a lot of work with our local utility, BC Hydro, to really get an understanding of where the capacity is in the distribution networks, where we can start to deploy out the other 30 plus chargers that we want in the next 5 or 6 years. And that's one of our major challenges, is really understanding where the capacity is. And we know for a fact it's very limited. So looking forward to building up on that relationship with BC Hydro, our local utility.
Thank you, Steve. We'll go around. Shawn, what's next for you?
Yeah, in the short term, we're going to finish up construction of these ports, and we have a lot of aspects of our launch campaign that we're putting out a lot of information about this program to make sure that we get as much utilization as we can. In the long term, we're going to gather as much data, the data that I mentioned earlier, and see how we're going to help the city reach those targets of 1,000 and 10,000 public curbside ports by 2025 and 2030.
Excellent. Irina, and then we'll end with Francis.
Yes, so for us, continuing to work with our partners across all segments and really focusing on the fleet segment. In the early days, those likely would be hybrid use cases, to where it's a public/fleet, workplace/fleet, and even residential/fleet implementation. So looking to partner with both public and private fleets.
Thank you so much. And Francis, the last word is yours.
Look, we are present in, as we said, across North America. And so vehicle electrification to date has really been a tale of two cities, or two types of territories. And in one bucket, I'd put a few Canadian provinces, namely Quebec and British Columbia, as well as California. And then there's everyone else, and the adoption rates are staggering. And so, I would say, as we see green shoots in the rest of North America, that's where we'll be focusing our growth on both sides of the Canada-US border, and having that there's a big enough market for ourselves and frankly for a number of other players, and it's really just around managing growth and being able to deliver our customer satisfaction and client uptime in a scenario where we are growing at a rate that's the same or frankly significantly faster than even EV adoption. So it's just managing that growth and continuing to deliver for our partners.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, on that note, I want to thank Irina, Francis, Steve, and Shawn as I see you on my screen. This has been a fantastic conversation. I want to especially thank all of our participants who asked some of the best questions and most voluminous questions. So making my job easy here. I appreciate all of you so much. Well, on that note, it's been my pleasure to host you this afternoon. As I said at the outset, we'll have this on YouTube for posterity. So I encourage you all to watch it again if there's anything you missed. On that note, thank you all so much. Have a great day, and we'll be back soon with more CoMotion Impacts. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.